The courthouse corridor was nothing like Emma had imagined. She'd pictured something grand and imposing from the movies, with towering ceilings and dramatic lighting. Instead, it was mundane, fluorescent lights humming overhead, beige walls that seemed to absorb sound, and an overpowering smell of industrial cleaner mixed with old wood. The bench beneath Emma's 9-year-old frame was harder than anything she'd ever sat on, and despite her mother's reassurances that morning, nothing felt safe anymore. Emma's feet didn't quite reach the floor, so they swung gently back and forth, her new shoes, purchased specifically for today, making small squeaking sounds with each movement. She hated the shoes. They were stiff and formal, nothing like her comfortable sneakers. Her mother had insisted on the whole outfit, a navy blue dress with a white collar, her hair pulled back in a neat braid, everything designed to make her look innocent, obedient, and sympathetic. Emma felt like an actor in a play she never auditioned for. Next to her, Bailey rested her head against Emma's knee, her golden fur warm and reassuring. The dog was Emma's most consistent companion over the past 18 months, the period that had somehow destroyed everything. Bailey was a service dog, officially certified to detect dangerous fluctuations in Emma's blood sugar, a complication she developed after her type 1 diabetes diagnosis 3 years ago. But Bailey was so much more than that. She was the only being in Emma's life who didn't take sides, who didn't use angry words, who didn't make promises that were immediately broken. Emma absently ran her fingers through Bailey's soft ears, a habit that calmed them both. The dog exhaled deeply, as if she understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. In fact, Bailey probably did understand. Dogs sensed emotions in ways humans struggled to articulate. Emma had read that somewhere in one of the many books about service animals she'd consumed in the past year, desperate to understand everything about her companion. The divorce had been devastating, but it was the custody battle that had shattered Emma's world completely. It had started civilly enough, her parents announcing they were separating, explaining that it wasn't anyone's fault, that they both loved her very much. Emma remembered thinking that was the worst part, actually. If one of them had been obviously cruel or evil, maybe it would have made sense. But they both seemed to genuinely believe they were the better parent, the one Emma needed most. That's when the fighting began in earnest. Her father hired a lawyer, a sharp woman with cold eyes and a voice that cut like glass. Her mother, defensive and hurt, hired her own attorney. Suddenly, Emma's life became evidence. Her report cards were scrutinized. Her medical records became ammunition. Every parenting decision was questioned, analyzed, weaponized. 6 months had passed since they'd last spoken directly to each other. 6 months of communication filtered through lawyers, of angry emails with subject lines in all capitals, of Emma overhearing phone calls where her name was mentioned like she was a possession to be divided rather than a person to be loved. The tension in the house had become suffocating. Emma would lie awake at night, listening to her mother cry in the next room, or she'd receive text messages from her father asking probing questions about what her mother did or didn't do. And then came the custody hearing notice. Today, right now, a judge would examine the evidence, the documented instances of her mother's alleged negligence with her diabetes care, the times her father claimed he'd had to step in, the accusations flying back and forth like birds in a hurricane. A judge, a complete stranger in a black robe, would decide which parent Emma loved most, which parent deserved to have her wake up under their roof in the morning. Emma's stomach churned. She hadn't eaten much breakfast, despite her mother's insistence. The diabetes made the nerves even worse. Stress affected blood sugar in unpredictable ways, and the last thing Emma needed was a hypoglycemic episode in the middle of her parents' custody battle. She'd checked her blood sugar 3 times that morning, each reading displayed on the small meter that had become as much a part of her life as breathing. Her mother's lawyer had prepared her. "Just tell the truth," the woman had said, her tone suggesting that truth was a simple, straightforward thing. But Emma had discovered that truth was complicated. The truth was that her mother did forget to check her blood sugar once or twice, but she always felt terrible about it. The truth was that her father was meticulous about her medical care, but he was also cold and controlling about it, treating her condition like a project to manage rather than a part of his daughter to understand. The truth was that Emma loved both of them and hated both of them simultaneously, and she wanted everything to go back to the way it was before, when she was just Emma, not a custody case number. The courtroom doors loomed ahead now, heavy wooden barriers separating the mundane corridor from the place where her fate would be decided. Emma could hear muffled voices from inside, people discussing logistics probably or other cases. Her father would be in there, her mother too, the judge, the lawyers, all of them gathered to determine where Emma would live, which home would be her real home, which parent would have her for holidays and school breaks and sick days. Bailey suddenly lifted her head and let out a small, comforting whine. Emma looked down at her dog, and for a moment she felt a spark of something other than fear. Bailey didn't care about custody arrangements or legal proceedings. Bailey's love was uncomplicated and absolute. Bailey would be by her side no matter what happened in that courtroom, and somehow that made everything slightly more bearable. Emma reached down and hugged her dog tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of Bailey's fur. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "we'll figure it out together, right, girl?" Bailey's tail thumped against the bench, her response as loyal as it was simple. Emma took a deep breath and squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for what came next. In just a few minutes, her childhood would either come together or shatter into 1,000 unrepairable pieces, and there wasn't a thing she could do but wait. The courtroom doors suddenly opened. The courtroom was colder than Emma expected and smaller. In movies, courtrooms always seemed vast and overwhelming, with soaring ceilings and imposing benches. This one felt cramped, almost claustrophobic. Everything was made of dark wood that had absorbed decades of tension and heartbreak. The fluorescent lights cast a sickly green tint over everything, making everyone look slightly ill. Judge Harrison sat behind an elevated bench, his gray hair neatly combed, his expression professionally neutral. He looked tired, Emma thought, the kind of tired that came from hearing too many sad stories and making impossible decisions all day long. Bailey had been taken to a waiting room with a court officer, leaving Emma utterly alone in the gallery. She sat on a hard wooden bench directly behind her mother's lawyer, Doctor, a woman in her 50s with sharp cheekbones and kind eyes that contradicted her reputation as a ruthless litigator. Emma's father, David, sat at the opposite table with his own lawyer, Richard, a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and dressed in the most expensive suit Emma had ever seen. Her father looked different today. His hair was perfectly styled, his tie coordinated flawlessly with his shirt. He'd even shaved extra carefully. She could see the smooth shine on his chin. He looked like the best version of himself, like he'd been polished and perfected for this performance. When Judge Harrison nodded toward him, David stood with practiced confidence and made his way to the witness stand. He placed his hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth, and Emma felt something twist in her chest. She knew her father. She knew that he believed he was telling the truth, which somehow made it worse. He genuinely thought he was the better parent. He genuinely thought her mother was negligent. And that conviction would carry in his voice, making every word sound authentic. "Mr. Richard began, his voice smooth as honey. Can you describe for the court your role in Emma's medical care?" David straightened in the witness stand, and Emma recognized the expression on his face. It was his "I'm the expert" expression, the one he used when he was about to explain something he believed others didn't understand. "My daughter has type 1 diabetes, which requires constant monitoring," he began. "Her blood sugar levels can fluctuate dangerously throughout the day. If not managed properly, she could experience life-threatening hypoglycemic episodes." The judge was taking notes. Emma's mother sat rigid in her seat, her lawyer placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "I've taken a personal interest in Emma's care," David continued, his tone suggesting this was an admirable quality. "I've attended diabetes management courses. I've researched the latest treatments and technologies. I check her blood sugar regularly, sometimes multiple times a day. I've implemented a strict dietary regimen. And your ex-wife's approach to this care? Interrupted, though it seemed like a planned interruption, part of a choreographed dance. David's expression shifted, became more serious, almost pained. That's where my concerns begin, he said. Emma's mother. She tries, I suppose, but she lacks the dedication and consistency required for such a serious medical condition. There have been incidents. Emma's mother's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her. Emma's mother shook her head vigorously, tears already forming. What kind of incidents? Prompted. David leaned forward, his voice taking on a confessional tone that made him sound sympathetic rather than accusatory. I've had to call ambulances 3 times in the past 18 months because Emma's blood sugar dropped to dangerous levels while she was in her mother's care. 3 times. He paused, letting the number hang in the air like a condemning verdict. One incident was particularly serious. Emma was at school, and her mother had failed to pack her glucose tablets. The school nurse called me in a panic. Emma was confused, shaking, unable to focus. Emma remembered that day. She remembered being scared, but she also remembered that her mother had been working late that day and her father, who usually picked Emma up, had rescheduled because of a business meeting. It was an accident, a rare oversight, but the way he was telling it, it sounded like her mother's negligence was habitual, dangerous, calculated even. The judge should know, David said, his voice gaining momentum, that I've documented everything. Every incident, every concern. I keep detailed records of Emma's blood sugar levels when she's in my care. I track her diet, her exercise, her stress levels. I'm not just her father, I'm her medical advocate. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. He made it sound so noble, so necessary. And in a way, he wasn't lying. He did do those things. But he did them in a way that made Emma feel like a science experiment, like her body was something to be controlled and perfected rather than simply lived in. And your concern regarding your ex-wife's commitment to this care continued. David's jaw tightened. I love my daughter more than anything in the world, but I fear for her safety. Her mother works full-time. She's often tired. She's emotionally unstable since the divorce. I've witnessed her crying, distracted, unable to focus. These are not the conditions under which a child with a serious medical condition should be living. Emma's mother stood up suddenly. Her lawyer grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. Judge Harrison looked up from his notes, making an observation about courtroom decorum. Emma's mother sat back, but her whole body was shaking. One more thing, David said, seizing the moment of attention. Emma has a service dog, Bailey. My ex-wife initially resisted having the dog, didn't understand its importance. Even now, I'm not convinced she fully respects Bailey's role in Emma's care. A child with a serious medical condition needs consistency, expertise, and, frankly, a parent who understands the gravity of that responsibility. He looked directly at the judge as he said this, his expression sincere and confident. I'm not trying to alienate Emma from her mother. I'm trying to protect my daughter's life. The judge's pen moved rapidly across his notepad. Emma's mother was crying silently now, her hands clenched in fists on the table. Emma herself felt frozen, unable to process how someone could take truths and twist them into something that barely resembled her actual life. When David stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Emma's eye for just a moment. He smiled at her, a smile that suggested he was doing this all for her, all in her best interest. And that was the most confusing part of all. He probably believed that. Retrie Emma's mother's lawyer, doctor, stood slowly after David stepped down from the witness stand. Her expression was calm, but Emma could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands trembled slightly as she organized her papers. She glanced back at Emma's mother with an expression that seemed to say, "Hold on, we're not done yet." "Your Honor," began, her voice measured and professional, "I would like to cross-examine Mr. regarding these incidents he's described." Judge Harrison nodded, making a note. Emma's father returned to the witness stand and approached him with the deliberate slowness of someone walking into a minefield. "Mister, you mentioned 3 incidents where your daughter experienced dangerous blood sugar drops while in her mother's care. Is that correct?" "Yes," David responded confidently. "Can you provide specific dates for these incidents?" David hesitated for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but Emma caught it. "Well, not exact dates off the top of my head, but they're documented. I have records." "Please, just tell the court what you remember about the most recent incident," interrupted smoothly. David shifted in the witness stand. It was approximately 6 months ago. Emma's mother failed to send proper snacks to school. Emma's blood sugar dropped during the afternoon, and the school nurse called me. "Did the school nurse call you, or did she call Emma's mother first?" asked. "She called me because I'm listed as the primary emergency contact for medical issues," David said, but his earlier confidence had wavered slightly. "Isn't it standard procedure for schools to call both parents in medical emergencies?" pressed. Yes, probably, but I responded faster." "So both parents were contacted, both parents were aware, and the school handled the situation appropriately by contacting emergency services if needed." His tone was neutral, but the implications were clear. Emma watched her father's face flush slightly. He looked angry, which happened when he felt like he was losing control of a narrative. "The point is that my ex-wife's negligence." "Mister, I'm asking about facts, not interpretations," said calmly. "Now, regarding your concern about Emma's mother's emotional state, have you witnessed her having a breakdown, or are you making an assumption based on the fact that she's emotional about losing custody of her daughter?" The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Harrison was watching this exchange with intense focus. "She cries frequently when Emma is around," David said defensively. "That's not appropriate parenting behavior." "Is it possible that a parent might have emotional reactions related to a custody dispute?" asked. "Is that indicative of negligence in medical care, or is it simply a human response to a traumatic situation?" David didn't answer, his jaw clenching. Turned away from him, addressing the judge directly. "Your Honor, Mister's testimony relies heavily on emotional language and implications rather than concrete evidence of medical negligence. 3 blood sugar incidents in 18 months, in the context of a child with type 1 diabetes, is actually not unusual. In fact, it's statistically expected. Additionally, Mister seems to be conflating emotional distress with parental incompetence, which are not equivalent." But then David stood up in the witness stand, his patience clearly exhausted. "Your Honor, you need to understand something about this situation," he said, his voice rising. His lawyer grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back down, but David shook him off. "This is about more than just blood sugar levels. This is about whether Emma's mother is capable of providing the level of care my daughter requires." Judge Harrison raised a hand. "Mister, you need to sit down and allow counsel to continue questioning." But David pressed forward, driven by something: anger, fear, conviction, some combination Emma couldn't quite identify. "She doesn't understand Bailey. That's the real issue here. Emma's service dog is trained to detect blood sugar fluctuations before they become dangerous. But Emma's mother has never fully accepted Bailey as a medical necessity. She sees the dog as an inconvenience, as something Emma relies on instead of learning to manage her condition independently." Emma felt her heart stop. Her mother loved Bailey, had spent weeks reading about service dog training, had attended classes to understand how to work with the dog, had cried with relief the first time Bailey alerted her to a dangerous dip in Emma's blood sugar. This wasn't true, but it sounded so plausible, so reasonable, so perfectly constructed to undermine everything. Emma's mother stood up suddenly, unable to contain herself. "That's not fair," she cried out. "I love Bailey, "Please sit down," Judge Harrison said firmly, though not unkindly. He looked troubled. Emma's mother sat, but her face was crumpling, tears streaming down her cheeks now. Her lawyer was whispering urgently to her, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at Emma with an expression of such helplessness, such desperation, that Emma felt something break inside her chest. This was it. This was the moment. Emma could feel it in the courtroom's atmosphere, thick and suffocating. Her father had successfully painted a narrative in which he was the devoted, competent parent, and her mother was negligent, emotional, and incapable of understanding her daughter's needs. The judge had been taking notes throughout David's emotional outburst. His expression had shifted from neutral to concerned. David finally sat back down, his lawyer looking like he wanted to strangle him, but the damage was already done. The narrative had shifted. The story was no longer about facts. It was about Emma's future, and that future was being decided by a man in a black robe who was hearing one version of the truth and finding it more compelling than any other. Emma wanted to stand up. She wanted to tell the judge that her mother wasn't negligent, that she loved Bailey, that her father was distorting everything. But no one was asking Emma. She was 9 years old, and in this courtroom, her voice didn't matter. Her life was being decided by adults who thought they knew her better than she knew herself. The judge looked up from his notes and directly at Emma's mother. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he announced. "Then Ms. will take the stand." Emma's mother looked destroyed, like someone who just realized they were fighting a battle that had already been lost before it began. And watching her mother's face crumble, Emma understood something with crystalline clarity. Today was going to determine not just where she lived, but whose version of reality would become the official truth. The 15-minute recess felt like 15 hours. Emma sat in a small consultation room with her mother and doctor, but the silence between them was deafening. Her mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Doctor paced back and forth, occasionally glancing at Emma's mother with an expression that suggested she was recalculating strategy, trying to determine how to recover from a battle that seemed to be slipping away. "Your mother is going to testify now," Doctor said gently to Emma. "I know this is hard, but I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. When your mother takes the stand, she needs to be calm, composed, and factual. Your father's testimony was highly emotional, which actually works in our favor because it shows he lacks objectivity. Your mother needs to demonstrate stability and competence. Can you understand that?" Emma nodded, but she wasn't really listening. She was thinking about Bailey, waiting somewhere in this building without her. She was thinking about how her father had twisted everything, making reasonable things sound sinister, making love look like negligence. She was thinking about how unfair it all was, how none of this should be happening at all. "Also," Doctor continued, "I'm going to ask about the service dog. Your mother's relationship with Bailey is actually one of our strongest arguments. This shows that she's capable of understanding complex medical needs and working collaboratively with tools that help Emma." Emma's mother finally looked up. "I do love Bailey," she said, her voice small and broken. "I've learned so much about the dog, about how important she is to Emma. I could never treat Bailey as an inconvenience." "I know," Doctor said, and her voice held genuine compassion. "And you're going to tell the judge that. You're going to show him that you're not just Emma's mother. You're Emma's advocate, her supporter, her partner in managing her health." When they returned to the courtroom, Emma noticed that Judge Harrison looked thoughtful, almost troubled. He'd been making some notes during the recess, his expression contemplative. Emma's mother took the witness stand, and despite her earlier dissolution, she pulled herself together with visible effort. Her hands stopped shaking. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady. Doctor began gently, asking Emma's mother about her background, her employment, her relationship with Emma. Through careful questioning, a different picture emerged. One of a devoted single mother who worked hard, who had learned about her daughter's medical condition, who had adapted her entire life to support Emma's needs. "Can you describe your relationship with Bailey?" Doctor asked. Emma's mother's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, They seemed to be tears of conviction rather than despair. "When Emma was first diagnosed with diabetes, I was terrified," she began. "I read everything I could find. I attended support groups. I learned how to help my daughter manage her condition. When Emma's father suggested getting a service dog, I was initially worried. I thought it might make Emma dependent on the dog instead of learning to manage her own health." She paused, collecting herself. "But I was wrong. I attended the service dog training with Emma. I learned how Bailey works, what the alerts mean, how to support the bond between Emma and Bailey. Bailey isn't a crutch for Emma, Bailey is a partner. The dog has given my daughter confidence and independence. I love Bailey like I love Emma because Bailey allows my daughter to live a normal life." Emma watched the judge's expression shift slightly. He was listening now, really listening, in a way he hadn't when her father spoke. But then David's lawyer stood up. "Ms., isn't it true that you've forgotten to provide Emma with proper diabetes supplies on multiple occasions?" "I've made mistakes," Emma's mother acknowledged. "I'm human, but I've never been negligent about Emma's care. Every mistake I've made, I've learned from." "And isn't it true that your daughter has experienced several dangerous blood sugar episodes in your care?" "3 episodes in 18 months, yes," Emma's mother said. But Emma's father has conveniently failed to mention that Emma has experienced approximately the same number of episodes in his care. Type 1 diabetes is unpredictable. Blood sugar fluctuations happen to all children with this condition, regardless of parental supervision. The lawyer seemed frustrated that she wasn't crumbling under pressure. He pressed forward with several more questions, but Emma's mother remained calm, factual, and measured in her responses. When Emma's mother finally stepped down from the witness stand, she looked exhausted but somehow stronger. She'd fought back without being reactive, had presented her case with dignity. Judge Harrison set down his pen and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. The courtroom fell silent. Emma could hear the clock on the wall ticking, could hear someone shuffling papers somewhere behind her. The judge looked troubled, genuinely conflicted. Finally, he spoke. "I've heard testimony from both parents," he said slowly. "I've heard competing narratives about Emma's care, her medical condition, and her emotional needs. However, I find that I'm missing a critical perspective in this case." He put his glasses back on and looked directly at the bailiff. "I'm going to make an unusual request," he announced. "I understand that Emma has a service dog named Bailey. I want that dog brought into this courtroom, right now." Both lawyers immediately stood up, looking shocked. Richard spoke first. "Your Honor, that's highly irregular. Service dogs in court." "I'm aware that it's irregular," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice firm. "However, I believe that seeing the bond between Emma and her service dog, observing how they interact, will provide me with insight that testimony alone cannot give me. This is about understanding the dynamic at the center of this case, and I believe the dog's presence is relevant to that understanding." Emma's mother looked hopeful. Her father looked uncertain, like he was trying to calculate whether this move would help or hurt him. Within 10 minutes, a court officer appeared with Bailey. The dog walked into the courtroom on her leash, her golden fur gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Emma's heart jumped. She hadn't seen Bailey in hours, and the dog seemed to sense the tension in the room immediately. The court officer brought Bailey toward the gallery where Emma sat, and the dog's entire demeanor changed the moment she saw Emma. Bailey's tail began wagging, and she strained against the leash toward the girl. "You can sit with your dog," the judge said to Emma, a note of gentleness in his voice. Bailey was released from her leash and immediately moved to Emma's side, pressing against her leg and resting her head on the girl's lap. Emma wrapped her arms around her dog, breathing in the familiar scent, feeling Bailey's warmth and presence like an anchor in a storm. Judge Harrison watched this interaction intently, his expression unreadable. Emma could feel his gaze on her, studying her, trying to understand something through the lens of what he was witnessing. "Now," the judge said quietly. "I'm going to ask Emma to stay in the courtroom while we continue. I want to observe the dynamic between the child and her service dog during the remainder of these proceedings." Emma's parents exchanged glances, clearly unsure what this development meant. But Emma understood. The judge was trying to see the truth, not the truth as presented through competing narratives, but the truth as it existed in the genuine bond between a girl and her dog. Emma sat perfectly still with Bailey's head resting on her lap, her fingers buried in the dog's soft fur. The courtroom had settled into an expectant silence, as if everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen, though they couldn't quite articulate what. Judge Harrison was watching her intently, his earlier judicial detachment replaced by something more curious, more engaged. He'd asked for Bailey to be present, but Emma could tell he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for or what he expected to see. The proceedings continued. David's lawyer called another witness, a medical expert who about the complexities of type 1 diabetes management. The expert spoke in clinical terms about blood glucose monitoring, insulin administration, and the risks of hypoglycemic episodes. Emma listened with half her attention, while the other half was focused entirely on Bailey, on the warmth of the dog against her leg, on the steady rhythm of Bailey's breathing. Her father watched her intently from across the courtroom, and Emma realized he was nervous. He'd underestimated her somehow. He told the judge about Bailey, had tried to use the dog as evidence against her mother, but he hadn't anticipated that the judge would actually want to see Bailey, to observe the relationship firsthand. Her father had built a narrative, and now reality was being brought into the courtroom in a way that might complicate that carefully constructed story. Emma's heart began to race. She could feel it happening, the subtle shift in Bailey's body, the slight tension that had nothing to do with the courtroom environment. Bailey's ears perked forward slightly, and the dog's breathing changed. Emma recognized the signs immediately. Bailey was detecting something. Her dog was sensing a change in Emma's blood sugar levels through some mechanism of canine perception that science still struggled to fully understand. Emma looked down at Bailey, then at her parents, then at the judge. She made a decision. For months, she'd been quiet. She'd been the object being discussed, examined, analyzed. She'd been the possession that two adults were fighting over, the pawn in their game. But Bailey had given her something more than medical alerts. The dog had given her a voice, a way to communicate something true about herself that transcended adult narratives and legal strategies. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she reached into her lap, positioning her fingers in the specific gesture she and Bailey had practiced hundreds of times. It was subtle, barely noticeable to an untrained observer. Just a slight movement of her hand against her thigh, a deliberate positioning of her fingers that had become their private language. To anyone not familiar with Bailey's training, it would look like Emma was simply adjusting her position, brushing her dress, fidgeting. The kind of unconscious movement any 9-year-old might make while sitting in a tense courtroom. But Bailey knew, Bailey understood. The dog's response was immediate and unmistakable. Bailey's entire body tensed with purpose. Her ears shot forward, her eyes widened with focus, and she lifted her head from Emma's lap with sudden urgency. The dog's mouth opened slightly, and a soft whine emerged, the specific alert sound that Bailey had been trained to produce when she detected a dangerous change in Emma's blood sugar. More dramatically, Bailey pressed her paw firmly against Emma's arm, the pressure deliberate and insistent. The dog's whining grew slightly more pronounced, a clear communication of concern and warning. Bailey's entire demeanor had shifted from relaxed companion to focused medical alert dog, and the transformation was striking enough that everyone in the courtroom noticed. Judge Harrison's pen froze mid-note. His eyes widened as he processed what he was witnessing. He'd been waiting to see something, but he clearly hadn't expected this. This demonstration of genuine medical partnership, this real-time alert unfolding before his eyes in response to Emma's deliberately hidden signal. "What's happening?" Judge Harrison asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just witnessed something profound but didn't fully understand it yet. Emma's mother gasped from the witness stand, or maybe she'd already stepped down. Emma wasn't entirely sure of the timeline anymore. Her entire focus had narrowed to this moment, to Bailey's alert, to the judge's reaction. Richard stood up. "Objection," he began, but Judge Harrison raised a hand sharply. "I don't think objections are appropriate here," the judge said quietly. "I think we're witnessing something important. Emma, can you explain what just happened?" Emma's mouth was dry, but she forced herself to speak. "Bailey is alerting me," she said, her voice small but steady. "She's telling me that my blood sugar is dropping dangerously. I made a signal to test her and she responded." "You made a signal?" Judge Harrison leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "It's a secret signal that I taught Bailey along with the trainer," Emma explained. "We practiced it a lot. When I make the signal, Bailey checks if my blood sugar is low. If it is, she alerts me like this. She puts her paw on my arm and whines. That's how I know I need to eat something to bring my blood sugar back up." Judge Harrison removed his glasses slowly, his expression transforming into something Emma couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also something else, a kind of dawning realization, as if pieces of a puzzle were suddenly clicking into place. "How often do you do this?" he asked. "Every day," Emma said. "Sometimes twice a day, sometimes more if I'm sick or if I've been exercising a lot. Bailey knows my body better than anyone else in the world. She feels things that I don't feel yet. She's like my extra sense." The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Emma could hear the clock ticking. She could hear someone breathing heavily, maybe her father, maybe one of the lawyers. She could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Emma's mother stood up from where she'd been sitting, her face a mixture of emotions: shock, pride, something that looked like vindication. Bailey continued to press against Emma's arm, still alert, still communicating urgently. The dog didn't understand courtroom proceedings or custody battles. Bailey only understood that the girl she loved, the girl she was trained to protect, needed medical assistance. Judge Harrison put his glasses back on very slowly, as if the act required great deliberation. He looked at Emma, then at Bailey, then at her parents. His expression had shifted entirely. The skeptical judge who had been taking careful notes, who had seemed to be swayed by David's testimony, was gone. In his place was a judge who had just witnessed something that transcended arguments and narratives. "I need to understand something," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying new weight. "This signal that Emma used, did she demonstrate it on her own, or was she asked to demonstrate it?" "I did it myself," Emma said quietly. "I wanted to show you, I wanted you to see." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, and Emma could see something shift in his eyes. He just understood the profundity of what he'd witnessed. Not just a service dog's training, but a 9-year-old girl's attempt to communicate her own truth in a situation where adults had been controlling the narrative. And that changed everything. Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, and for what felt like an eternity, he simply stared at Emma. His expression was unreadable, but Emma could sense that something fundamental had shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. The judge removed his glasses entirely now, setting them on the bench in front of him, and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. When he looked back up, his eyes glistened with moisture. "Let me make sure I understand what I just witnessed," he said slowly, his voice carrying a different quality than before, less judicial, more human. "Emma, you created a signal that you taught to Bailey. You tested the dog's ability to detect your blood sugar fluctuation, and you did this voluntarily in order to demonstrate something to this court. Is that correct?" Emma nodded, her heart still pounding. Bailey's alert had subsided slightly, but the dog remained pressed against her side, clearly still focused on Emma's. "Emma, how long have you been working with Bailey on this particular signal?" the judge asked. "Since we got Bailey 2 years ago," Emma answered. We practiced it with the trainer, and then my mom and I practiced it at home. A lot. Like hundreds of times. Judge Harrison's gaze shifted momentarily to Emma's mother, then back to Emma. Your mom practiced this with you? Yes, sir, Emma said. She wanted to understand how Bailey works. She wanted to be able to help Bailey help me. The judge stood up from his bench, a move that seemed to surprise everyone in the courtroom. He walked to the edge of the elevated platform, looking down at Emma with an expression of profound realization. Emma could see tears now, actual tears, streaming down the judge's face. I need to say something, Judge Harrison began, addressing the entire courtroom. He looked first at Emma's father, then at her mother, then back at Emma. In my 30 years as a judge, I have presided over thousands of cases. I have listened to countless arguments, examined mountains of evidence, and made decisions that affected people's lives in fundamental ways. But I want to tell you what I just witnessed here, because I don't believe I'll ever witness something quite like it again. He paused, clearly gathering his thoughts, clearly moved by emotion that transcended judicial objectivity. What I observed was not simply a service dog performing her training, he continued. What I observed was a sophisticated, genuine partnership between a child and an animal. This girl, he gestured toward Emma, has demonstrated a level of maturity, responsibility, and self-awareness that exceeds what I would expect from many adults. Judge Harrison walked slowly down from his bench, an informal move that would have been unthinkable moments before. He approached Emma and Bailey's tail began wagging. The alert dissolved now that the immediate situation had passed. Emma, the judge said, kneeling down to be at eye level with the girl, can I ask you something? And I want you to answer honestly. In all the conversations about your parents' custody battle, did anyone ever ask you what you wanted? Did anyone ever ask you about your own thoughts regarding where you should live? Emma's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head. Judge Harrison's expression crumpled slightly. He stood up, and when he turned back to face the courtroom, his judicial mask had fully dissolved. That ends now, he said firmly. I'm going to address what I've learned from this extraordinary moment. He walked back toward his bench, but instead of sitting behind it, he remained standing in front of it, making himself more accessible, more human in that moment than any Judge Emma had ever seen. First, let me speak to what I witnessed regarding the service dog, Judge Harrison began. I initially requested that Bailey be brought into this courtroom because I wanted to observe the dynamic between Emma and the dog. I wanted to understand whether their relationship was as critical as both parents suggested. What I've discovered is that their relationship is far more sophisticated and important than either parent adequately conveyed. He looked at David. Mister, you are correct that Bailey is a critical medical tool for your daughter. However, you were incorrect in your characterization of your ex-wife's relationship with the dog. A parent who practices hundreds of times with a service dog, who attends training, who learns how the dog communicates, that parent is not negligent or dismissive. That parent is engaged, responsible, and deeply committed to understanding her child's medical needs. David's face flushed red. His lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm. Judge Harrison then turned to Emma's mother. Ms., you also deserve recognition. You've demonstrated not just medical competence, but genuine understanding. You've learned alongside your daughter. You've supported the bond between Emma and Bailey rather than viewing it as a replacement for your own care. Emma's mother was crying openly now, but they seemed to be tears of validation rather than despair. However, Judge Harrison continued, I need to address something more fundamental than either parent's competence in medical care. I need to address the maturity and emotional intelligence that Emma has demonstrated in this courtroom. He turned back to Emma. Emma, you made that signal to Bailey not because anyone asked you to. You made it because you understood on some level that you needed to communicate your own truth. You understood that adults were telling different stories about your life, and you found a way to demonstrate something genuine, something real, that transcended those competing narratives. That's remarkable. Emma felt tears streaming down her face, but she wasn't sure if she was crying from relief or sadness, or just from the overwhelming weight of finally being heard. That level of maturity suggests something critical, the judge continued. Emma is not just a passive object in her own life. Emma is an active participant in her own care, her own health management, and her own. Emma understands her condition. Emma works collaboratively with her dog. Emma has thought deeply about her own needs, and therefore Emma deserves to have her voice heard in these proceedings. The judge returned to his bench and sat down, wiping his eyes. "I'm going to continue with this hearing," he said, his voice more controlled now but still laden with emotion. "But I want to say something on the record. This case is no longer just about what Mr. or Ms. believes is best for Emma. This case is now about what Emma herself has demonstrated about her own needs, her own capabilities, and her own understanding of what supports her." He looked directly at Emma. "Young lady, what you did today took courage. You communicated something that adults needed to hear. Bailey is not just a medical tool. Bailey is evidence of your own remarkable responsibility and maturity. And that matters. That matters in this courtroom, and it should matter to both of your parents, regardless of where you ultimately live." Emma's father looked shaken. He'd built a narrative in which Emma was vulnerable, dependent, in need of his protection and expertise. But what he just witnessed was a girl who was none of those things, a girl who was aware, capable, and able to advocate for herself in profound ways. Judge Harrison picked up his pen again and began writing rapidly. "I'm going to need to speak with Emma privately," he announced. "I want to hear from her, in chambers, about her own preferences, her own needs, and her own perspective on this situation. But I want to tell all parties in this courtroom right now, what I witnessed today has fundamentally altered my understanding of this case." He looked at Emma one final time before returning his attention to his notes. "Emma has just taught me something about parenting, about responsibility, and about what it truly means to support a child. And that is a lesson I will carry with me far beyond this courtroom." Courtroom was packed now. Word had spread among the courthouse staff about the unusual proceedings, and several people had drifted in during the recess, ostensibly on other business, but actually drawn by the gravity of what was unfolding. Emma sat with Bailey, her dog's head once again resting on her lap, and she felt suspended between time. The moments before the judge's decision seemed to stretch on infinitely, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Judge Harrison had spent the previous hour speaking with Emma in his chambers privately, away from lawyers and parents and competing narratives. Emma didn't know what would happen next, but something in the judge's demeanor suggested that he was preparing for a decision that would likely disappoint at least one parent, possibly both. When the judge returned to his bench, the courtroom fell silent. Everyone stood out of respect, and the weight of tradition seemed to press down on the room. Judge Harrison looked older than he had that morning, as if the emotional intensity of the proceedings had extracted a toll. But his eyes were clear, and his expression was resolute. "Please sit," he instructed, and the courtroom settled back into its seats. Judge Harrison opened a folder containing his notes, and Emma could see pages and pages of handwriting. The judge had been thorough in documenting everything that had transpired. He looked at Emma first, nodded slightly as if they shared an understanding, then turned his attention to the two lawyers and the parents. "I have reached a decision in the matter of V regarding custodial arrangements for Emma," Judge Harrison began. "This has been one of the most complex custody cases I've encountered, not because of the legal issues involved, but because of the exceptional circumstances surrounding it. I want to explain my reasoning before I announce my decision." He removed his glasses and set them on his bench, preferring to speak without them, as if the decision he was about to make required him to be more human, less judicial. "Both parents have presented arguments regarding their ability to provide medical care for Emma," the judge continued. Mr. emphasized his expertise, his documented records, and his concern about his ex-wife's competence. Ms. emphasized her commitment to learning, her partnership with Emma, and her emotional presence in her daughter's life. Both arguments had merit. Both parents clearly love Emma. David leaned forward slightly, as if the judge's words so far suggested victory might be within reach. Emma's mother sat rigidly, her hands clenched in her lap. "However," Judge Harrison said, and that single word seemed to shift the entire atmosphere in the courtroom, "this case took a remarkable turn when I made the decision to bring Bailey into this courtroom. Because what I witnessed was not just parental competence being demonstrated. What I witnessed was a child who had taken responsibility for her own health, who had developed genuine partnership with her medical support system, and who had the maturity to communicate her own truth in a situation where adults were competing over her future." The judge paused, and Emma noticed tears forming again. He seemed to be a man deeply moved by the proceedings, by what he'd learned, by the implications of his decision. "Emma spent time with me in chambers," Judge Harrison said. "She answered my questions honestly and thoughtfully. She discussed her medical condition, her relationship with both parents, and her own preferences regarding where she wanted to live. And I want to tell this courtroom what I learned from that conversation. Emma is not a child in crisis. Emma is not a vulnerable victim caught between two warring parents. Emma is a remarkably mature young woman who understands her own needs, who advocates for herself, and who has a clear sense of what kind of environment supports her." Emma felt tears slide down her cheeks. She tried so hard in that private meeting with the judge to be honest, to be clear, to help him understand her perspective without betraying either parent. "Now," Judge Harrison said, "I'm going to issue my custody decision. However, I want to preface this by saying that this decision is not a statement about who is the better parent. Both parents love Emma. Both parents have demonstrated commitment to her care. This decision is, rather, a determination about what living arrangement best serves Emma's documented needs and preferences." He opened his decision document, and Emma noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "Primary physical custody of Emma is hereby awarded to her mother, Karen," Judge Harrison announced. "Emma will reside primarily with her mother during the school year and maintain her established routines, including her service dog training regimen and her medical care protocols." Emma's mother gasped, her hand covering her mouth as tears began streaming down her face. Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she also felt guilty about the look on her father's face. Visitation rights are awarded to David as follows: every other weekend, from Friday evening through Sunday evening, and 2 weeks during the summer vacation period, the judge continued. This arrangement allows Emma to maintain meaningful relationship with both parents while preserving the stability she clearly requires for her health management. Judge Harrison looked directly at Emma's father. "Mister, I want to be clear about something. This decision is not a judgment on your parenting ability or your love for Emma. This decision reflects Emma's own stated preferences and her demonstrated need for consistency in her primary residence. Emma has established specific routines in her mother's home, routines related to her medical care, her relationship with Bailey, and her overall. Disrupting those routines would not be in her best interest." David looked devastated, but he nodded slightly, acknowledging the judge's words even if he disagreed with the verdict. "However," Judge Harrison continued, "I want to issue specific conditions with this custody arrangement. Both parents are ordered to attend family counseling with a therapist who specializes in custody situations and childhood medical conditions. This counseling is not optional, it is a condition of the custody arrangement." The judge looked at both parents. "You need to understand something fundamental. Emma is not a prize to be won or a possession to be divided. Emma is a person, a young person who will carry the scars of this conflict into adulthood if you do not heal your relationship and learn to cooperate. Emma does not need to choose between parents. Emma needs both parents to support her, to stop using her as ammunition against each other, and to work collaboratively in her medical care. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Additionally, both parents are ordered to attend parenting classes, specifically focused on type 1 diabetes management and service animal care. You need to understand that Emma's medical condition requires sophisticated parental knowledge, and you need to be partners in that management rather than competitors. Judge Harrison then addressed the room more broadly. I also want to acknowledge something that has transpired in this courtroom today. Emma demonstrated extraordinary maturity and responsibility. Emma's mother has clearly invested in understanding her daughter's medical needs, and Emma's father has shown genuine commitment to medical excellence, even if his approach has been overly controlling. He looked directly at Emma again, and his expression softened considerably. Emma, I want you to know that the signal you made to Bailey today, that moment changed this entire proceeding. You reminded me and everyone in this courtroom that custody cases are not about parents. They're about children. They're about what children need to thrive. And what you needed was to have your voice heard, to have your agency recognized, and to have your own wisdom acknowledged. Judge Harrison stood up from his bench, a final gesture of respect and emotion. This court is adjourned. Both parents are to report to family services within 2 weeks to begin the mandated counseling and parenting classes. Emma's primary residence is with her mother, effective immediately. The custody arrangement outlined in this decision takes effect immediately. As the gavel came down, Emma felt Bailey's tail wagging against her leg. She'd won something today, not a victory exactly, but recognition. She'd been heard, and somehow that was more valuable than anything else could have been. 2 weeks had passed since the court decision, and Emma sat at the kitchen table in her mother's house, her primary house now, the place where she woke up most mornings and fell asleep most nights. The word primary still felt strange to her, as if the court's decision had formalized something that should have always been understood. But that was the world of custody arrangements, of legal language and formal declarations. Bailey lay at her feet, her golden head resting on Emma's sneaker, completely content. Outside, autumn was creeping across the neighborhood. The leaves were beginning to turn, and there was a crisp quality to the air that suggested change, transition, new seasons approaching. Emma was working on her homework, algebra, her least favorite subject, but her concentration kept drifting away from the equations on the page to the calendar hanging on the refrigerator. Her mother was making dinner in the background, humming softly as she chopped vegetables. Emma had almost forgotten what that sound meant: contentment, peace, normalcy. For so long, her mother had been tense, anxious, caught in the defensive posture of someone fighting for their child. But something had shifted since the court decision. It was as if her mother had finally been given permission to breathe. "Emma, how was school today?" her mother asked, adding the chopped vegetables to a pot of broth. The smell immediately filled the kitchen, something savory and comforting. "Good," Emma said. "Mrs. Harrison asked about Bailey. She wants to know if we can do a presentation for the class about service dogs." Her mother smiled warmly. "That sounds wonderful. We could talk to the trainer about it, see if there's an educational component Bailey could do." This was new, her mother treating Bailey not as a responsibility or an inconvenience, but as an opportunity for Emma to teach others, to share her expertise. Emma realized that her mother had genuinely transformed her perspective over the past 2 weeks. Her phone buzzed with a text notification. It was from her father. "Hi, Emma. Just confirming that I'm picking you up this Friday at 6 p.m. Your mom said that works. Looking forward to our time together. Love you." Emma texted back a thumbs-up emoji. The first weekend visit after the court decision had been awkward, both of them uncertain, still processing the changes. But her father had seemed different. He'd asked her about school, about Bailey, about her diabetes management, without the controlling edge that had characterized his previous involvement. It was as if the judge's words had reached him, had helped him understand that there was a difference between being a good parent and trying to control every aspect of his child's life. "Your dad texting?" her mother asked, not with the bitter edge Emma had heard so many times before, but with genuine interest. "Yeah, confirming this Friday," Emma said. "That's good," her mother said. "I think these visits are going to be really helpful for both of you, and I want you to know, I'm not going to use these visits as an opportunity to undermine your father or to make you feel guilty for going. You need time with him, and I'm okay with that." Emma felt something release in her chest. For months, she'd felt like she had to choose, had to prove loyalty to one parent over the other. But her mother was giving her permission to love her father, to have a relationship with him, without it being a betrayal of her mother. That evening, Emma checked her blood sugar before dinner, a routine so automatic now that she barely thought about it. The meter showed a healthy reading. Bailey didn't alert, which meant everything was stable. Emma had developed such intimacy with her own body through this process, such understanding of its rhythms and fluctuations, that she sometimes felt ancient despite being only 9 years old. After dinner, her mother sat down next to Emma on the couch. "I want to talk to you about something," she said gently. "The judge ordered me to attend family counseling and parenting classes. I started the parenting classes this week, the one specifically about type 1 diabetes and service animal care." Emma looked at her mother, curious where this was going. "I learned something in that class that I wanted to share with you," her mother continued. The instructor talked about how children with chronic medical conditions sometimes develop emotional maturity faster than their peers. She said that managing a serious health condition teaches kids responsibility and self-awareness that other children might not develop for years. She said that my role as your parent isn't to control every aspect of that, but to support it, to nurture it, to help you grow into the capable person you're already becoming. Emma felt tears prickling her eyes. "Does that mean you're not mad at me for what I did in court, for the signal?" Her mother pulled her into a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not mad at all. I'm proud. I was so proud watching you communicate your truth like that. You were so brave, so clear, so mature. I know your father and I made this situation very difficult for you, and I'm sorry for that. But watching you handle it, that gave me hope that you're going to be okay, that we're going to be okay." Over the next few weeks, the new routine. Emma established patterns, school days with her mother, Friday to Sunday with her father every other weekend. Her father had made significant changes. He'd attended the parenting classes as ordered, and he'd come away from them humbled. During their visits, he asked Emma about her diabetes management but didn't try to control it. He celebrated her successes with Bailey, asked her questions about her training with the dog, treated her like a collaborator in her own care rather than a patient to be managed. One evening, about a month after the court decision, Emma's mother received a call. It was David. Emma watched as her mother's expression shifted from cautious to surprised to something that looked like hope. "Yes, I think that's a good idea," her mother said into the phone. "Emma would probably enjoy that. No, really, I think it's a great suggestion. Okay, I'll talk to Emma about it. You too, take care of yourself." When her mother hung up, she looked at Emma with an expression Emma hadn't seen in a very long time, genuine peace. "Your father wants to take you to the diabetes center next week for a follow-up appointment. He asked if I wanted to go too, all of us together. I said yes. He seems to understand now that this isn't about proving who's the better parent. It's about both of us being present for you." Emma felt something warm bloom in her chest. The idea of her parents being in the same room together for something other than a legal proceeding, without animosity or tension, seemed almost impossible. But maybe it was becoming possible. That night Emma sat on her bed with Bailey and pulled up her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized herself, not because she looked different physically, though she'd probably grown an inch, but because something fundamental had shifted in how she carried herself. She looked calmer, more centered, more whole. Bailey pressed her head against Emma's leg, and Emma made their secret signal just for fun, just to hear Bailey's alert response, just to celebrate the bond they'd built together. The dog's paw came up to Emma's arm on cue, and Bailey's familiar whine filled the quiet room. "Good girl," Emma whispered, scratching Bailey's ears. "We did it. We really did it." The truth was, Emma had navigated something that should have been impossible for a 9-year-old to navigate. She'd been caught in the middle of her parents' conflict, used as ammunition, treated as a prize to be won. But through it all, she'd maintained her own sense of self, her own agency, her own voice. And when she'd finally used that voice, with Bailey's help, she'd changed everything. As autumn deepened into winter, Emma's life found a new rhythm. Her parents attended their counseling sessions. Her mother completed her parenting classes and continued to deepen her understanding of Emma's medical needs. Her father learned to step back, to trust his daughter, to support rather than control. And Emma continued to grow, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, as a person who understood her own worth. Bailey remained at the center of it all, the faithful companion who had somehow, through the simple act of being present and responsive, helped a family heal. One evening, Emma looked at her reflection again and smiled. The scared girl who'd sat in that courtroom corridor, terrified about her future, felt very far away now. In her place was a young woman who understood her own strength, who knew how to ask for help, who understood that maturity wasn't about being perfect. It was about being honest, about being present, about showing up for yourself and for the people you loved. And as Bailey's tail wagged against her leg, Emma knew that she'd received the greatest gift any parent could give. Not control, not certainty, but the freedom to become herself. The end.